We're back now with some analysis from our political panel. Ruth Marcus is a columnist with The Washington Post. Rehan Salam is executive editor of The National Review. Molly Ball is a politics writer for The Atlantic. And Jonathan Martin is national political correspondent for The New York Times. Rehan, I want to start with you. Donald Trump, is it essentially now his nomination to lose on the Republican side?
He has big structural disadvantages, but I'd say the biggest advantage that he has is this. You just saw him talking about, all kinds of subjects, but it really is the kind of gut level message. If you look at his support, it is heavily concentrated in parts of the country where over the last 20 years, manufacturing jobs have disappeared in large numbers. And if you look at over the last 20 years, which industry is it that Washington has fought to support? They were really desperate to make sure that our big banks could compete with the banks in London and Tokyo and elsewhere. And so they passed a series of laws to ensure that they were in the best shape to compete globally. Whereas if you look at our industries, if you look at the Rust Belt, if you look at these parts of the country, these are parts of the country where they don't really feel like they've had friends and allies. And Donald Trump doesn't actually talk about deindustrialization or whatever else, but what he does say is that the people in charge are not listening to you. They are fundamentally untrustworthy, whereas I am plain-spoken and can be trusted. And whichever candidate is going to win the Republican nomination is someone who can channel that anger and that feeling of being left out and not listened to.
Jonathan, Donald Trump says he's going to win Iowa.
I was so struck by that there at the end, John, because so much of the expectation of these primaries is driven by what the candidates say going in, how they set up their own assumptions about what states they're going to perform well and where they're going to win, whether they're only going to do well. And by saying that, he basically has raised the bar on his own campaign in Iowa to the point now where if Cruz does beat him, that's going to be even more of a blow for Trump than it otherwise would have. So Trump is so Trumpian, he can't help himself, but in doing so, he has unwittingly sort of raised the bar on himself.
Oh, that's a
well,
winner has to win.
He'll just deny that he said it. If
no,
he ends up losing.
But a winner has to win, and that's the challenge,
votes are cast,
isn't it?
yeah.
Right, when the votes are cast.
That is his challenge. But I think to answer your question, to Rehan, it is his to lose right now. He may well not win Iowa, and we really still do have questions about whether these Trump voters are actually Trump voters as opposed to Trump supporters. But it is. I think the only word that comes to mind here watching your interview with him, which was terrific, is appalling. In terms of his lack of substance, his lack of deep thinking, his failure to answer really serious questions like the one that you asked him about what is the implication of your turning up in this ISIS video? Because you've said very hurtful things that really can encourage people to join ISIS, and how do you deal with that? He doesn't have answers to these questions or any serious questions, and I really just find myself thunderstruck that we're at 2016 and at this point.
All right, well, we're going to talk about more of this, Molly, when we get back. All of you sit tight. You sit tight out there. We'll be back with more analysis from our panel. Welcome back to Face the Nation. I'm John Dickerson. To talk more about all things politics, we are joined by Ruth Marcus of The Washington Post, The National Review's Rehan Salam, Molly Ball of The Atlantic, and Jonathan Martin of The New York Times. Molly, I want to pick up where we left off with Donald Trump. There is this theory that we're less than a month away from Iowa voting, that voters are going to start thinking about these candidates as president. It'll get more substantive. They'll start thinking about them in the Oval Office. Do you think that's right in this case?
It sounds like wishful thinking to me on the part mostly of the Republican establishment, which has, been chasing its own tail for months about this Trump phenomenon. First thinking that somebody had to take him out, but it had to be the other guy, and then thinking, well, that we've all got to get together and do it, and that didn't work, and there's this sort of collective action problem on the part of the other candidates. But now we seem to have moved to this wishful thinking phase where, well, the voters will just wake up from this bad dream we've all been having, and I'll believe it when I see it, but most, actually all predictions about the inevitable decline of Trump have fallen short so far. I will say that I don't know if anyone actually pointed this out. When he says he's leading in Iowa, that's not true right now. All of the more recent polls actually do have Ted Cruz up in Iowa. So there's sort of a corollary to the wishful thinking that says when he loses a state, as you sort of alluded to before, he won't seem like a winner anymore. It'll sort of deflate the balloon and everybody will just peel away. So that's a possibility. But what I heard in that interview that was new to me was he was going after Ted Cruz.
On immigration, same week on immigration.
They've had this very ostentatious love fest, the two of them so far, and then in the last debate practically hugging. And now you hear Trump actually finding a line of attack. And interestingly, we're ending the year where he started his campaign with immigration, and he has a point in what he's saying.
Which
about
never
Cruz.
would have come up if it weren't for Donald
Right, he
Trump.
invented the issue.
But will Trump do it
Haven't you heard?
consistently? And that's been his challenge because
Will he take on Cruz
He did go after
consistently, you mean?
Cruz in Iowa in December, and he actually started going down that road. But he couldn't keep it up because the problem is that Cruz is nice to him. He's killing him with kindness, and
And the talk radio loves Cruz.
It's so hard.
They'll
Yes.
take-
Right, that's
they'll
right.
take
They're going
Cruz's
for the
side
It's
same
so
over.
hard
voters.
for Trump to target somebody who's nice to him, and Cruz figured that out long ago. And so his approach has been very shrewd. Cruz has, which is you hug him, you hug him really close.
Well, and the
Hug me
genius
death,
of
both.
the genius of Ted Cruz is also the fact that if you look at the Republican Party, if you're looking at the elite side, fundamentally you have these libertarian instincts. And what Donald Trump has demonstrated is that this libertarianism does not run very deep with actual Republican voters. Not very deep at all. So what Ted Cruz has done, and you see this actually in his fundraising, what he's done is he's managed to get some of that kind of libertarian, business class, Wall Street Republican support, while also getting that kind of populist nationalist support, a bit of that. And that also means that you get small donors as well as big donors. Trump, however, to me, what he's done, whether or not he wins, I have no idea, honestly.
Right.
But whether or not he wins, he's demonstrated that libertarianism, cutting top rates, cutting cap gains taxes, all of this stuff doesn't actually matter to real life Republican voters. 40% of Republican voters say that they want upper income taxpayers to pay higher taxes. Who ever do you see in a Republican primary come out and say, you know what, I'm going to leave the top rate alone and I'm going to focus on middle class tax cuts, something like that. Marco Rubio has flirted with this idea without really pursuing it as aggressively as he might have, because he too has that straddle. He has to keep both sides of the party happy. But I think what Trump is demonstrating is that there's this whole other lane for Republicans to pursue, this populist, nationalist lane that is very potent.
The
Isn't
gut
that more
level rather
affected
than
policy, though?
With Trump, it is,
Yeah.
but he's demonstrating that there's a market for that if someone can actually sell that message. And Cruz fundamentally is a libertarian. He's fundamentally a guy who went to
Let me
Princeton.
ask you-
He's
Well,
fundamentally-
while we're talking
a social
about
conservative, and that's the portion of Cruz's support that I don't think Trump gets.
Yes.
Because Cruz is and you heard Trump actually sort of going after Cruz on the religion thing, which was very weird and a little bit race baity almost, saying that because he's Cuban, we can't be sure he's really an evangelical. But that is the portion, especially of the Iowa electorate, that I don't think is accessible to Trump for multiple reasons, and you don't hear him really trying to speak to, and so that's an advantage for Cruz, I think.
Ruth, let me ask you about this fracas between Hillary Clinton / Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. They got it into a back and forth. Hillary Clinton said Donald Trump was sexist. He said, if you want to have a full and frank conversation about how do you think that works out, you were quoted favorably by some people as having said this was fair game.
I do think it's fair game.
To talk about Bill Clinton.
To talk about Bill Clinton for two reasons. One is Hillary Clinton attacked Donald Trump appropriately and correctly for sexist remarks, of which there are many. Bill Clinton's record with women then becomes fair game. She also has designated him as her surrogate in chief. He'll be out on the campaign trail this week. When she does both of those things, attacks Trump for sexism, picks Bill Clinton as her surrogate, his record becomes fair game. And when I say record, I'm not talking about extramarital affairs. I'm talking about his conduct, predatory, offensive, inappropriate with women, including in the Oval Office. That becomes fair for Trump to raise. Whether it affects any voters, that's a different question. I think it's smart for Trump to raise in a primary campaign. There are no Republican voters who are going to be offended by this. In a general election campaign, it's a much dicier topic.
Yeah, does this work in the general election, Jonathan, or is this just a brushback pitch? In other words, a signal to Hillary Clinton that if she doesn't want this to be talked about, she should stop attacking.
I'd be very surprised if the nominee is not Trump if they went down that road in a general election, because history has proven that it's not effective politically.
In 1998, Republicans
Correct.
went after Bill Clinton on this, and they had a bad year electorally.
Huge blowback.
But he does have a point with when he talks about how she's pandering to women. We do see Hillary Clinton very much leaning into sort of feminism as identity politics this time in a way she didn't in 2008, in a way that was seen as damaging and dangerous in 2008. She had to be Margaret Thatcher. She had to be tough. She had to be genderless. And this time around, it's a very different campaign that she's running. She's talking very openly about being the first woman president as an asset of her campaign, as something she wants to accomplish. So I do think that that number one, he has a point. in pointing that out. Some people may be offended by it, some may not. And number two, I think Ruth is exactly right, that if Hillary is going to say that the things that Bill Clinton did that are regarded positively accrue to her credit, but the things that are negative she had nothing to do with, well, that's ridiculous, and it is fair game.
Rayhan, let's broaden this out now and talk about the larger Republican field. We've got Donald Trump. We've talked a lot about him. What do the other candidates do to make some inroads, to make a claim to win the nomination?
It's going to be very regionally specific at this point, I imagine. And, as you guys all know, I mean, in New Hampshire, you have a particular quirky kind of race in which Chris Christie is doing very well. He's completely invisible in the rest of the country, but he's doing quite well there. And it's all this jockeying for third place, this idea that Jeb Bush needs to get into third in Iowa to be viable going forward. And I would say that over the kind of medium term, what matters is, who is acceptable to everyone. As guys get knocked out, kind of if someone finally says something sufficiently outrageous, and that's why Marco Rubio, who's been pretty underwhelming in early state polling, that's why he's still lurking and people still think of him as one of the big three, let's say, Trump, Cruz, and Rubio, because people still more or less finding him acceptable. People who are, let's say Jeb or Christie fans certainly do, but then also people who are otherwise Cruz fans, see him as, he's basically conservative, made this one huge mistake on immigration from their perspective, but that I think is going to matter more. And also this could be a race in which actually one can preserve one's viability after not having done well in the first 2 or 3 primaries. It seems likely to me.
Ruth, let me ask you about this terrorist video and Donald Trump's role in it. It seems to me that if we go back to this notion, Molly called it wishful thinking, that voters start to look at the candidates as president. This is a case, somebody would say, where Donald Trump's mouth had real consequences. Do you think there's any strength in that argument that anybody's going to be able to use this against Trump, this video, the fact he was used in a terrorist video, that has anything, or is this just another instance in which Trump supporters won't mind and it'll be fine?
I'm tempted to engage in some wishful thinking. The consequences of Trump's outrageous statements, which we could go on for 3 more hours, don't seem to be affecting his support among voters.
Right.
So it's hard for me to see that this one does. At the same time, I have been waiting to see and kind of hoping to see the electability moment happen among voters. You certainly hear that in past cycles from voters, particularly in New Hampshire, where they, Republican voters ought to be saying, it's our turn, we need the White House back, and they ought to be looking at Donald Trump and saying, he's not going to get us there.
How do the candidates raise that against Trump, which you haven't heard yet, but I think you will hear in the coming weeks? It's remarkable that on January 3rd, we are looking at a primary where it's entirely plausible that Donald Trump rolls and becomes the nominee, and it's also plausible that he does not win a single state. We just
in the general election or in
the primary. We just
Okay.
don't know what's going to happen. We just don't know what's going to happen, and I think we have to basically acknowledge that this is a very uncertain territory that we're entering. But what is striking is the degree to which nobody is even confronting the front runner. If you believe it's Trump, and Molly mentioned this, where is the money against him? He has not been touched at all. Howard Dean in 2004 was widely seen as a disaster against George W. Bush. The Democratic establishment rallied and targeted him. You've not seen anything like that this time around, which makes this an entirely different kind of race. And I think that's in part because, as Molly pointed out, a lot of folks in the establishment are skeptical that his folks will actually show up. But it's also because they don't want to get in a tit for tat with him because they know that he hits back hard. So the end result of that is to have this guy, less than a month before Iowa, completely untouched.
I think Jonathan talked about something important, which is the dog that hasn't barked this campaign. It was supposed to be all about money. It was supposed to be all about super PACs. Jeb Bush's super PAC has spent something like $50 million on ads that have.
But we haven't
gotten to
seen
scorched
But
earth.
it's
Except there's a little
really
bit.
remarkable how little impact money has had
But we haven't
so
seen negative
far
ads
in
yet,
this
though.
race.
And we've seen a little negative on the non-Trump. In other words, it's everybody else attacking each other, not going after the big dog. Speaking of money, we've got to talk about the Democrats in our remaining minutes here. Bernie Sanders put out this interesting quote, Molly, when he released his fundraising numbers. He had a very good, strong number. And at the end, he says, quote, incredibly, the vast majority of all the money we have raised comes from small dollar contributions. You won't see that from our opponent. I don't go around asking a handful of millionaires and billionaires for big checks and call it a day. Boom. That's right at Hillary Clinton. That's
Oh,
about money.
absolutely.
Is that effective?
I think it's very effective. If you're on the trail with Bernie Sanders and he starts to rail against Citizens United, it is very much at the heart of his candidacy, this complaint about money in politics. And interestingly, Trump echoes him a little bit there, because I do think this is a completely bipartisan phenomenon, the anger at money in politics. So yes, you know, it's very $33 million for Bernie Sanders in the fourth quarter versus $55 million for Hillary Clinton. And this is her, you know, holding fundraisers multiple times a day, and he has held, I believe, one. Right. So that is really remarkable, and it tells you that, you know, look, I don't think Bernie Sanders is likely to win this Democratic primary, but he will have made a huge impact and had a huge voice by proving that there is this liberal groundswell out there, proving that there is a segment of the Democratic Party that wants to hear the things that he is saying. He's already forced Hillary to the left on issues, but more than that, I think he's telling us something about this national mood and what voters are concerned about.
Well, but imagine if Bernie were more charismatic. I mean, when you think about that amount of money relative to the amount of money that Americans spend on, you know, tight pants, for example, I mean, it's just not that impressive. I actually am surprised that he didn't raise more money. And this whole idea that it's, you know, it's all small donors, how amazing is that? But that also is why he's so weak. You know, go back to Ted Cruz. Here's a guy raising from big donors and small donors. He's got the balance. Jeb Bush only from big guys. So you want to have that balance. And even if Hillary Clinton is underwhelming, she at least is able to connect with, let's say, some unmarried, white, lower middle class women who might be willing to write her a $20 check, as well as the rich guys in DC and LA. So I think that that's why Bernie, you know, ultimately, you know, any candidate in that lane was going to raise a fair bit of money.
But
I would not have
think
predicted
that's
Bernie
accurate
Sanders.
at all.
I would
Ruth,
not
we're
have
going to have
predicted
to cut you off there. So thanks all very much to our panel. We'll be right back. Joining us now is former White House National Security Advisor Tom Donilon and former Deputy CIA Director and CBS News National Security Contributor Michael Morrell. Tom, I want to start with the news with you. The Saudi embassy in Tehran was ransacked after Saudi Arabia executed a cleric who'd been critical of the Sunni kingdom's treatment of Shiites. What's the significance of this?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, the reaction was predicted and predictable. Two, at the same time that the United States is seeking to lower tensions in the region in pursuit of an effort against ISIS and a political process in Syria, this raises tensions. And three, I think it reflects a couple of things. It's one of the key conflict dynamics in the Middle East, the Sunni-Shia dynamic. It reflects, I think, how Saudi Arabia sees the threat both internally in Saudi Arabia and the kingdom, but also externally. And it needs to be said that Iran is a principal force for destabilization in the region, and Iran looks around at what Saudi Arabia looks around and sees what Iran is doing in Beirut and in Damascus and in Sana'a and in Baghdad, and feels, I think, a threat. And it also reflects this competition for influence in the region between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So it's an increase in tensions at a time when the United States is trying to decrease tensions in pursuit of major policy objectives.
I just wanted to add that I think the Iranians, in this case, acted responsibly. The police showed up very quickly. They made a number of arrests. I hope the Iraqi government acts as responsibly. The Saudis just last week opened up an embassy in Baghdad for the first time in 25 years. I hope this doesn't reverse that.
Let's stay in Iraq. Ramadi has been retaken or partially retaken by Iraqi forces. Why is that so important? Retaken from ISIS, which took it in May. Why is that important?
It's important for two reasons, John. The first is what was taken from ISIS, and the second is who took it. In the what was taken, right, this is a strategically significant city, the largest city in Anbar province, the capital of Anbar province, where the Sunnis in Iraq live, on the strategic road to Syria, on the strategic highway to Jordan, 70 miles from Baghdad, an embarrassment to the Iraqi government when they lost it 7 months ago. So what was taken is of significance. And then the who took it, right? All of the gains to date in Iraq have been by the Kurds or by Shia militia. In this case, it was Iraqi security forces.
Yeah. Tom, will we look back on this and say this was a turning point for the reasons Mike outlines?
Oh, well, I think it's important progress, no doubt about that, and a part of continuing progress against ISIS, where they've lost about 30% of the territory that they had at the height of their sweep across Iraq. But I think it also needs to be put in some perspective as well. Number one, we have a long way to go. This operation took 8 months 630 or so U.S. Airstrikes, a tremendous amount of support for the Iraqi security forces in pulling this off. Second, it's a smaller city. It's an important city, as Michael said. It's the capital, the provincial capital in Anbar. But the next phase is Mosul, perhaps, as the Iraqi Prime Minister said. And Mosul's 5 times as big as Ramadi. And third, there are challenges in Ramadi. We'll have to provide security. The Iraqis have to provide security. People need to know if they come back there, they're going to be secure. We'll need to see reconstruction. The United States and other countries have pledged $50 million for reconstruction. And most importantly, we need to see progress towards inclusion of Sunnis in Anbar politically in Iraq.
Mike, there was a story by Karen DeYoung in the Washington Post this week about the president being frustrated that his ISIS strategy, the countering of ISIS strategy, was not getting the kind of public relations explanation that he wanted, and that he was getting a bad rap for things. What do you make of that argument, the fact that this is a communications failure more than an actual failure on combating ISIS? And secondarily, how has the fight against ISIS picked up since, in the last 2 months?
So I think what you're likely to see, John, over the next year is without a diplomatic settlement in Syria, I think what you're likely to see is a growing gap between success in Iraq militarily. It looks like the Iraqi security forces are beginning to get their act together. That's very important. They do face challenges, as Tom has said. So a growing gap between success in Iraq and a lack of success in Syria. So I think that's where the diplomatic focus needs to be, the military focus needs to be in Syria going forward.
There's no doubt that the Iraqi security forces are improving in terms of their capability. We saw that in Ramadi. And I think progress can be made against ISIS militarily. And indeed, I think it's critical in 2016 that the United States and the coalition of some 60 countries who are facing off against ISIS break the narrative of success. Mm-hmm. That's the key recruiting tool that this group has around the world. And that's important because this group, and I do think we'll make serious progress against them in 2016, they have metastasized. They're kind of indiscriminate franchisers, right? And we've seen them present real challenges around the world, including in places like Libya, which I think will end up being challenges for us going into 2016.
Let me ask you, Tom, about that metastasization question. People have had some difficulty putting ISIS in context. Marco Rubio calls it a clash of civilizations between radical Islam and the West. Others have said, no, this is just a fight against a big group, ISIS, which needs to be taken care of, but it doesn't have that kind of cultural breadth. Help us put this into some frame.
Well, it's a unique challenge, I think, in some ways an unprecedented challenge. It has controlled territory. It's an insurgency in Iraq. It threatened the Iraqi state. It is well financed from a variety of means. It has a top-down control structure. It has also been the recipient of some 30,000 foreign fighters. That's the largest kind of compilation or aggregation of fighters we've ever seen in a circumstance like this. So it's a unique challenge. But 2 other things make it unique, in addition to the foreign fighters who ultimately could come home. It has taken advantage of technology. And really, ISIS and a number of the other groups we see in the world have come to a nexus with technology, which has allowed them to recruit more broadly than just in the theater in Syria and Iraq. And that's what we've seen. We've seen that through the establishment of these provincial or other franchises, if you will, around the world. And we've also seen it in their ability to radicalize individuals and groups around the world to take action. That is a unique and new challenge.
Let me just, in our last couple minutes we have here, we got a year ahead of us. Mike, what should we be keeping our eye on in terms of big challenges in this next year, say outside of ISIS, which we've talked about?
So I think one big challenge is going to be the reemergence of Afghanistan as an issue. The Taliban have made major gains over the last year. I would expect similar gains going forward. They control more territory now than they have in a number of years. I think the debate on how many troops we keep in Afghanistan is going to reopen. General Campbell already last week said we need upwards of 10,000 troops, which is double the number the president is currently looking at.
Yeah. Tom, your thoughts about
Well, I think that we have a continuing challenge with respect to ISIS, and I think that's the principal security challenge. I think Michael's right about Afghanistan. I think also you'll see in the final year of President Obama's term a big emphasis on foreign policy and national security. If you look at the calendar between now and the end of President Obama's term, there's a major event or foreign policy trip every month. during the course of it. And that's presidents typically go in this direction because they have much more freedom to act in foreign policy than they do in domestic and legislatively in the last year. And I think you'll see that, and there'll be challenges to deal with. There'll be consolidation and implementation of things that the president's already put in place, and some opportunity. For example, he'll be in Asia twice. He'll have Asia-related events 4 times. He's seeing President Xi 3 times in order to try to consolidate the Asia rebalance.
Mike, quickly, last 30 seconds. Reports the U.S. spying on Israeli officials. Put that into context or explain it to us.
So can't comment about specific intelligence activities, of course, and in this case, I don't know what exactly was happening, right? It's been 3 years since I've been in government. But I'd say a couple things. One is we're looking at 2 different issues here. One issue is a decision to spy perhaps on a leader of an ally, right? That's a decision that's made at the highest levels of our government. That's where it should be made. And I would say that we should always keep open the option of being able to spy on anybody when it's on our national security interests. The second issue is how information with regard to Netanyahu's discussions about his relationship with the U.S. Congress are handled by the intelligence community. There are very specific rules about that, and the Congress is looking into whether those rules were followed in this case.
All right, Mike Morrell, thanks so much, Tom Donlan. We'll be back in a moment. That's it for today. Be sure to tune in next week. We'll be talking with the new Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. Until then, for Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.